Hello. It is the 28th of September, 2018, and this is episode 97 of the Unseen Podcast. My name is Paul Carr, and with me tonight, so far, we just have Nick Nielsen. Say hello, Nick.
Hello, Paul. Hello, Paul.
And Nick is the only one to show up out of several maybes. We were going to have Daniela, but when she found out what time it was in Europe, she decided that it wasn't going to work for her. So we'll get Daniela some other time, either on this podcast or another one. Anyway, to catch up with what she's doing with Cogito, which has been quite a bit in the last year or so. Anyway, let's see. So Nick, the topic tonight that we have kind of converged on is not the Supreme Court hearings, anything other than the Supreme Court hearings. No, actually, what was announced recently was the Dear Moon project. I'll give a quick background on that. I'm not sure what the schedule is, but a very wealthy Japanese artist and entrepreneur has contracted with SpaceX. He's going to take a trip on a big Falcon spaceship to go around the moon with a crew of artists. It's a very interesting and unusual sort of type of mission. It's people have been saying for decades that artists should go into space, poets should go into space. They even think, some people even think kids should go into space, but they're doing it. They're taking artists into space, and there's a number of artists who've already made a case for their particular project in going around the moon. And so that's not going to land on the moon. Nobody's going to. They're going to stay inside the spaceship the entire time, but they will be the first humans to go in orbit around the moon since the Apollo days. So, Nick, does that strike you as clever or stupid or what? I mean, or something in between?
First, I'm skimming through the New York Times article here. It says the rocket will not be ready for the trip until 2023.
Yeah, so that sounds about right. In fact, I would think remember, that's Elon time. so figure 2025 or something like that.
Yeah. Well, but if we consider how NASA projects slip, like James Webb Space Telescope, I mean, what's the anticipated launch for that now? Of course,
21, but probably not that. Probably more like 22.
Right.
Yeah, and that's so. If you slip a year every year, then nobody believes your schedule, right? So you have to eventually start converging. But
eventually,
yeah. Well, they were gonna launch this year, and everybody believed that until about a year ago, and then, no joy. But
having hard deadlines and a deep pocketbook, can make an enormous difference. So when Kennedy said we're going to get to the moon before the end of the decade, and then made the money available to make it happen, that it was made to happen. When a Cold War is not involved, things would be a little more loosey-goosey, you could say.
Yeah, well, also, everybody flying...
But whether or not...
Yeah. Everybody flying on Apollo was a test pilot, right? So it was that test pilot ethos where, this is dangerous. We can't assure your safety. You guys have to be brave. And NASA wants to have like a living room in space, which they're not going to get. And where everybody can be perfectly safe. I think SpaceX is somewhere on the other side of that.
Right. Well, I don't think that. I think NASA was pushed by a combination of selective factors toward its current level of risk aversion. And yeah, SpaceX is probably a little bit down from that in terms of risk aversion, but they've done some wonderful things. A lot of people even people who aren't particularly interested in space, were pretty drawn in by the twin booster landing when they came down simultaneously on different launch pads. So,
Yeah. That was after
whether
a
or
lot
not
of
this will make
failures. I mean, they had the SpaceX philosophy, which I agree with, is to fail early and often.
And that was NASA's. One of the things that's interested me about reading about the early history of the space program is how many early space missions failed when the first were sent to orbit or to land on the moon. A lot of them failed. A lot of them hit. A lot of them missed. And there was a culture then also of fail early, fail often, and learn all you can from it.
Well, they've left. They buried a lot of test pilots in the 50s, working on various types of propulsion concepts. And by the time they got to Apollo, they knew how to do it pretty much unmanned, so they didn't have to risk a pilot's life. And so they did an extra. Apollo mission lost 3 astronauts on the ground due to a very unfortunate accident, but they didn't have a single person killed in the flight program, and that was because they had learned a lot from a lot of failures early on. And you don't put a guy in a capsule until you've made all the big mistakes with that rocket. And Chiro's trying to hang out. Chiro, I've sent you a message. Hold on. Let me give me. I'm trying to get Chiro on. So.
Whether or not this proves to be the big splash that it could be, that's the real question. Whether, whatever you do when you spend several $1 billion to send a few people up into space, you're going to get criticized, whether you took up other billionaires with you, whether you took up artists, intellectuals, whether you took teachers. So, ideally, you take a bunch of artists up into space, as the fellow has suggested. Let me remind myself of his name. The Japanese entrepreneur is Yusaku Maezawa, who owns the Japanese clothing company Zozo. If Mr. Maezawa took a bunch of artists up into space and they found themselves incredibly inspired, there would still be a lag time between when these artists got their inspiration and came back to Earth, and then were able to produce works of art, and then these works of art could enjoy some reception among the public, and then the public might in turn be inspired by them. That's a process that takes time. So by selecting artists for the trip, I think that we can't fairly judge it until literally years after the fact. Whereas if you're going to take journalists up and they're going to take a bunch of heavy camera gear and report breathlessly from orbit, you expect to be a much more immediate impact that would fade over time. Whereas the choice to take artists would potentially, if it goes well, be something that would only increase over time. And once again, there's been a lot of criticism of NASA for not putting people like artists up in space. But in the early part of the space program, they did bring a lot of artists on board, and they didn't put them into space, but they did participate in the space program by making paintings and illustrations. There's a Norman Rockwell painting of astronauts, for example, that was commissioned by NASA. So they commissioned a bunch of art, and they employed artists to a certain point, but they just didn't get them up into space or put them on the space station. And since starving artists don't have any money, they can't, like Dennis Tito, afford to give themselves a ride onto the space station. But if somebody else, like an entrepreneur, can afford to put them up into space, well, great. Maybe something will come of it. We can
Well,
always
yeah,
hope.
they have to understand that, this is kind of more like an Everest expedition. Well, probably not quite that dangerous, but I mean, people do very dangerous things all the time for fun, like base jumping and mountain climbing. But, they have to understand that it's on that level of risk. It's not the delusion that we had in the 80s that you could send a teacher into space and she would be in no danger. We had that and we got our fingers burnt doing that.
But as you imply, people do dangerous things all the time. And let's say instead of taking artists in space, he just held a lottery. You know, sometimes when you talk to people, they'll say, who aren't interested in space, they'll say, "Oh, nobody really wants to go in space." But when you actually open it up, just like Mars One, I mean, they had enormous numbers of applicants for that. I'm sure if you opened up any rocket for volunteers, I mean, the volunteers would be there.
I would sign up
in much, yes, in much larger numbers than a lot of people expect would be the case. And people would be, people would, I literally, if you could have people sign ironclad agreements that nobody's going to be held responsible and you could be killed and you have to accept that and we're not going to pay your family anything if you are killed, there would still be far, far more volunteers by orders of magnitude than there would be spots available.
Yeah, well, you go rock climbing or skydiving, you're going to sign this very similar agreement, right? And in fact, right. The Virgin suborbital flights that are
right.
going to start soon will have, they're going to have to get people to recognize, hey, this is pretty safe, but it's not as safe as getting on an airplane and flying to Kansas City.
Do you know how many people can be taken up other than the pilot in Spaceship Two or whatever it's going to be called?
No, I don't, but I think it's order of a few people.
6 or 8 or fewer than that?
I'm not sure.
I was just curious.
Now, or one of me. I'm a little bit larger than the average bear, but I think that's a very common sort of thing that happens all the time. People take risks in order to have a thrilling experience, and we're not like a ride at an amusement park where it's thrilling, but it's actually quite safe. My son goes on those all the time. He loves it, but he's actually very safe. I'm not worried about him. But people go on Mount Everest. There's a lot of those people who are dead.
Yes, I've heard that people climb Mount Everest. You can point to bodies on the side of the trail. Oh, that guy is from 1982. That guy is from 1993, because there's so many bodies on the side.
Probably
of the
guys
trail.
that were there last year, because it's extremely dangerous to climb Mount Everest, even if you're a very good mountaineer, with lots of training and in extremely good shape. Because there's not much air up there, and likewise, people that do things like base jumping for fun. You're always hearing about another experienced, capable one, right, who just took that little risk more and ended up dead. And I almost think that if you couldn't end up dead as a result of doing that, they'd be less interested, because
I agree.
It wouldn't be dangerous. If nobody ever died doing it, it would be less interesting. So it's not like sending somebody into the front lines of a war, but it's on the order of some of these recreational risks that people take. And these artists, sensitive souls that they may be, are going to need a lot of training. They're going to have to be in shape, and they're going to because they have to potentially deal with low oxygen or other strenuous situations. And they're going to have to except that they might not come home. And I still think you'll get lots of artists to volunteer, and it won't
Yes,
be.
I think you'll easily get a big enough pool that you can get a large number of contenders of good physical health who can be trained in a relatively reasonable period of time.
And it's not even clear they're planning to send anybody who's like a fighter jock along with them. It's just going to be a bunch of artists and a largely autonomous spaceship that is sort of mothers them through the whole process.
There's no reason that the spaceship at this point can't be made almost entirely autonomous. Obviously, if something goes wrong, you might want to fix it person on board. But that doesn't mean you would be better having a rocket scientist or an engineer aboard than having a test pilot aboard.
Yeah, and there may be somebody like that, just if no other reason, just to take data and
exactly.
observe the performance. But
it seems very likely that the SpaceX representative would be on board in addition to the.
It might even be Elon himself.
The manifest, yeah. By the way, I looked up Spaceship Two, and it says the capacity is supposed to be 8 people, 6 passengers and 2 pilots.
Oh, so six wealthy people.
6 wealthy people and 2 pilots.
Who are probably taking less risk than climbing Mount Everest, but still more risk than riding an amusement park ride. And
speaking of amusement park rides, even amusement parks, as hard as they try to be safe, they have accidents too. In fact, a few years ago, I got curious, and of course, I looked it up, and of course, there was a Wikipedia article there, on people who have died in Disneyland. And they settle these as quietly as they possibly can, and they rarely make it into the news. But people, even in Disneyland, people get killed, usually because they did something really stupid, like getting out of a Matterhorn bobsled while it's on the track, while its ride is operating. But still, people get hurt and killed, even in safe amusement parks.
Yeah, Florida, man, we'll do that. Yeah, there have been some horrible accidents, so they're very rare, I believe. In terms of the number of people if you think of the number of people that cycle through Disneyland every day.
Yes, a lot large. I don't know what their traffic is, but
well,
sure.
When we were there at Disney World in Florida, there was a lot of people there. Every ride had a line, and both, even the rides for little kids or the more thrill rides, and I'm sure it's extremely rare for them to have anybody hurt. And when somebody is hurt, they figure out what caused it, and they put in more safeguards to prevent that same injury from reoccurring. Probably the most common injury they have is people just heat exhaustion, heat stroke.
Right, probably. Yeah,
probably. It's freaking hot in Orlando. It's very humid. And people are walking for miles, pushing their baby strollers or whatever. So it's, but I imagine they probably have more heart attacks than they have people getting injured on rides by a wide margin.
Interestingly, it's Tokyo's Disney Sea has the greatest attendance rank of the parks, with 13 million people in 2016. Epcot has 11.7 million in 2016.
Oh, I've been to Epcot. It's actually one of the nicer Disney parks, but there's only one thrill ride there. But it's you mainly walk around and eat and drink. It's pretty nice.
I was in Epcot in 1983.
Oh. It probably hasn't changed much. I was there just a few years ago. We had to do it before my kids got too old. So
right. The proper age to enjoy.
The Magic Kingdom is definitely for little kids, but there's a lot of
stuff. They keep some traditional rides like Mr. Toad's Adventure and stuff like that apply.
The Haunted Mansion is still there.
Yeah,
still famous.
Right. Yeah.
They have. A lot of it is actually not so much about the rides. It's about the Disney story and the Disney heritage. But
Yeah.
It would take some effort to get killed at Disney. Now,
But
Six
it
Flags,
has happened.
Six Flags, a little bit easier, but you're probably more likely to be killed in a car accident going to and from than.
Yeah. Oh yeah, in terms of absolute risk, you're much more likely to be killed on the road than be killed in the park.
And it's just like, it's the same thing with air travel. Air travel has gotten ridiculously safe in terms of the passenger miles.
And you just mentioned not being put in, not as risky as being put in the front line of a war, but even wars kill far fewer people than in the past.
Well,
but
yeah.
the way that it gets treated by the media, because there are cameras everywhere and there are cameras right there on the front line, and you see people getting killed just like that, you'd think that the fatalities are higher than ever, but in fact, combat fatalities are at record lows in the past few major conflicts that have occurred.
Well, right. I mean, like the Second Battle of the Somme, where British troops are told to walk towards the German lines.
And the first day of the Somme, 20,000 British soldiers were killed.
Yeah, it didn't go well. And
battles are not fought like that anymore. Emphatically, no.
They're not. Although in World War II, people would take cover more, but the weapons were much more powerful and would.
Well, the increase in weapon accuracy and rate of fire, the interesting thing about the First World War is the weaponry was there, but the tactics wasn't, because we had rifled guns and the French had the French 75, which were rifled howitzers. And of course the first machine guns, what's the name of that one? I can't think of it now, but the first big machine gun that came into use in the late 1800s.
The Gatling gun?
That came earlier. The Gatling gun came in the 1860s. In 1884, I think the first true machine gun was designed. Anyway, these all came into combat in the First World War, but they didn't have the tactics to deal with it. What the real difference is in the Second World War is that the Germans developed blitzkrieg tactics, which are now the basis of all tactics. Small squad level units who swarm around the hard targets, take out the easy stuff first around the hard places, and then focus on them later as a mopping up operation. They didn't know how to do that in the First World War, and they were just told people to march in front of machine guns, and the slaughter was unprecedented, and it probably changed the direction of European history precisely because it was so unprecedented.
Yeah, it was. I've read a fair bit about it. It was absolute horror. The guys in the front lines, their odds weren't great. Just this constant shelling was part of,
It made people go crazy.
It made them go crazy, and also a lot of them got wounded that way. And others were, it was about 2/3 wounds, 1/3 killed. But it went on. That would go on through the whole winter while they were in their trenches. When they weren't really, no one was conducting offensive operations. They were still losing thousands of men a month from just the shelling, and that and people did. And if you ask the men in those trenches, why are you here? Well, it's for my country, right? I'm cannon fodder for my country, and but today you need we're asked, if you ask people, to take huge risks, there needs to be a really big rationale behind it, right? But if you're asking them say this is, you're likely to survive this, but there is a risk, but the reward is huge. I think you'll find lots of people signing up for that. There is some threshold where the risk is too high, and probably impossible to assess ahead of time, and people will say, "No, I'm not doing that." But it's anything below that. You'll get plenty of volunteers, and not only that, but you remember like Challenger, which blew up in 1986. It's not like they had to go scour the ranks of engineers and scientists to find people to go on the next mission 2 years later.
Yeah, it went.
There were lots of people willing to go. And I think if you'd polled people the day after Challenger, are you willing to go on the next mission? You'd get lots of people saying yes.
I agree. I agree.
So, in fact, you might even get more because they were inspired by the courage of their comrades. And so I think that what SpaceX has to do with this mission is they don't have to get it to risk zero, which would be delusional anyway. They have to get it to risk reasonably low.
Attractable risk, yeah.
And that means they will have to fly that spaceship in space. It doesn't have to go around the moon, because that's really not very important, but it has to be out there for a few days and demonstrate its worthiness.
Right. It has to go up to the atmosphere several times.
At least a couple times to the atmosphere, and then land successfully. And ideally, the one that the artists go on would be one that's already flown and has proven itself. I actually think that flight-proven boosters, if they're designed right, are safer than new ones, and because you don't know what manufacturing errors you might have made on the new one, but you didn't make any fatal manufacturing errors on the one that's being reused, and if you get good at doing the inspections and the refurbishment, which SpaceX has gotten really good at that. They're now on what you
have to do if you're going to build reusable rockets, you better get used to that.
Well, they got now what they call the Block 5, which is actually designed to be reused multiple times, and that's what they're doing. And
right. And if any weaknesses were in it, it would show up probably in the first.
Yeah, well, not only have they designed it to be tough enough to take the reuse, they've designed it to be easy to diagnose any problems that occur in flight and find those problems and fix them before they send it back up, or scrap it if it's just not going to fly again. And they have not really demonstrated many reflights yet, but they're on their path to doing that. And I think by the time we're probably talking next year, they will start flying prototype hardware, and by 2023, 2024, they'll have flown a couple of missions through the atmosphere. And their biggest problem right now with this, the biggest risk to this whole approach is the amount of cash it's taking out of SpaceX to make it happen. It's realistically going to cost a few $1 billion to develop this thing, just to the point where it can fly the Artemis mission, the Dear Moon mission. And that money's got to come somewhere. And while Elon Musk is worth a lot of money on paper, he doesn't have that much cash. So, in fact, after today, he's probably worth quite a bit less on paper. But Tesla took a bit of a bath today. But the stock market goes up and down, stock prices go up and down, paper wealth goes up and down. What their only real competitor right now is Blue Origin, which is funded by Jeff Bezos, who's the richest man in the world, and
many times richer than Elon Musk.
Yes, he's at least twice as rich, probably more like 3 times, and he's not only that, but he can generate cash faster than Elon can, because he has this massive cash cow called Amazon, and he can sell a tiny bit of his Amazon shares and raise a lot of money, and he's been doing that. He's been putting He's been selling a small amount of Amazon every year and putting a lot of money into Blue Origin, and that's a good thing for SpaceX in a sense, because they know they have somebody who could beat them if they don't stay sharp. They're not worried about SLS.
No. Well, SLS is going to be, what's the word I'm looking for? Superseded by the time it's already going to be. Oh, I can't think of the word I need. Going to be dated by the time it's launched.
That's very possible. Yeah. Now, what NASA? I think NASA doesn't really care about that too much, because it's going to be their launch vehicle, right? They can launch maybe one a year, maybe two if they're lucky. So they will need other launch vehicles anyway. So they can continue keeping their contractors bathed in cash and their marching army going, without having to say, oh my gosh, SpaceX has beat us already to this payload capability, or Blue Origin's already better than we are. And in terms of dollars, they're 10 times better than we are, but it doesn't matter. Here's our rocket. We're going to put what we want on it and fly it. And they just have to meet a reasonable schedule to be able to do that.
The SpaceX already has an incredible, record of pace of launches and reusability for its smaller rocket. So,
right. Well, Falcon 9 is actually a pretty big rocket. Compared to what I'm used to anyway, but it's not as big as SLS, of course, but, and Falcon Heavy, which is only flown once, is very big, but still not as big as SLS. So BFR is in that league.
Bigger.
Yeah. It's actually a taller rocket, but in terms of capability, because it can land and be reused, the capability per dollar is probably at least an order of magnitude better than SLS.
Do you know off the top of your head if the circumlunar mission requires refueling in orbit, or if they can just go up?
I don't believe they do require that, no. You don't need that much fuel. Right.
You just have to break Earth orbit and do a ballistic trajectory.
Yeah, you should be able to. Look at the Apollo missions. They didn't use that. They didn't have big tanks. They got back. Now it's challenging, but again, it was done in the 60s. So it's not now in the 60s, they built these amazing engines that we don't have today. So they have to sort of reproduce that, but they're pretty much already there in terms of, learning how to make it happen. And both Blue Origin and SpaceX are well on the way to have developing engines they need. So, in fact, this one of the other news items this week was that Blue Origin is now selling their engine to United Launch Alliance, which is the Boeing Lockheed joint venture, for their next rocket. So Blue Origin has a second customer for their engines, which is going to allow them to make a lot more of them and get their costs down. So that's it's going to be. And I've heard rumblings from people like the Air Force and NASA, and even the head of NASA saying, reusability is now officially a good idea. Of course, they're not doing it on SLS, but
and that's what makes it antiquated as soon as it launches. And we all know the sorry story of the SLS is that it's primarily political money and keeping stuff being built in particularly congressional districts. So
it's going to feel like building a 747 and throwing it away after you land.
Right.
That's how it's going to feel with reusability being a common practice. And so they have an issue. A lot of what's in SLS is very political and very much about keeping that the old school rocket industry alive and healthy and flush with cash. And SpaceX has not done that. They have used NASA money, but they've delivered NASA missions with it. So they have they've delivered value, and that's the result of that has been the that they have not only survived but thrived. And I think the most recent they've thrown a lot of commercial missions as well, which has given them money, but also things like TESS. TESS wasn't a flagship mission for NASA, but it still was a very popular mission and a completely successful mission. And that was delivered to an interesting orbit. So, it was, which is this 2-for-1 lunar resonant orbit, this 2-week orbit. And so that, NASA, the Falcon 9 is not just a low Earth orbit delivery system. It's delivered to much higher orbits. And so they have a lot going. And I think that you're going to see Blue Origin chasing them hard with some new technology and some really good designs. And there's also, on the smaller end, there's a lot of new rockets coming up. So, that market will be well served. But I think what interests everybody, including me, is the big rockets that can take us to the moon and Mars. And so we're hoping for that. And if we could, but the thing is, the Dear Moon thing wouldn't just be a PR coup, which it would certainly be if it was successful. It would also be I think it's a cultural shift, that we're not going to space to beat another nation. We're not going to space for science, just science. We're going to space because we want to.
We're going to space for human reasons.
Right, because that's what we want to do. And
Right.
and you don't have to struggle for this rationale for going to Mars or going to the moon or going to space at all. Any more than, that the people who went to Jamestown had to struggle for a rationale. They knew why they were going, because it was exciting and interesting and fun and dangerous and risky and the possibilities were endless. And that's what people want to do. People don't, we're really not a species that's built to sit at home and try to be safe. And I think
that's right. Our ancestors spread themselves over the entire planet because they kept walking.
They did.
They kept going into the unknown.
And what was it, 40,000 plus years ago, people went across the ocean to get to Australia. And, that must have been a huge leap of risk-taking and it might have been accidental. They might have been going out fishing and and got blown away by a storm. But, they colonized pretty much the entire Pacific Ocean that way, just going out in canoes. And
the Polynesian migration across the Pacific Islands was very methodical and taking small steps across the Pacific, whereas the colonization of Australia was more likely to have been an accident or a one-off trip.
Right. Well, we don't know how many times they crossed, but it might have been once, might have been 3 times.
The Aboriginal population of Australia is sufficiently genetically distinct that it seems to have only been one small group of people who came across and then inhabited the continent, and it's a different group. It's a different ethnic group than the Polynesians. In a previous Unseen podcast, we talked about how if the Europeans hadn't come along and disrupted things, the Polynesians might have eventually made it to Australia. They almost certainly would have eventually.
Mm-hmm. Well, they made it to New Zealand eventually.
Yeah. And all those tiny little places on the map like Hawaii and Tahiti and, stranded in the middle of the South Pacific.
Yeah, and I think that you look back at that and you say, "My gosh, what brave people!" But no, that's us. That's humans. More recently we had people, crossing going out the Oregon Trail and taking considerable risk to themselves and their children and their wives and just to get across to where they get some decent farmland or a place where they could settle. And they didn't really have to leave the eastern United States. They could have stayed there. But they saw, hey, land here is this many dollars a square per acre. And if I go out there, it's free per acre. I just have to stake a claim. And so, they were drawn to that. And so I think that, and nobody knows what the killer app's going to be, right? Nobody knows what you're going to be able to do economically when you get there. You might have some idea you're going to farm or you're going to fish or whatever, but what the next generation is going to do for a living, you don't know.
I read an interesting thing some time ago where Edison had listed the possible uses of the phonograph. There were like 80 possible reasons, including taking people's last will and testament before they died. At the very bottom of the list is recorded music.
Well, probably because it sounded like absolute shit back then. They couldn't imagine doing music that way, but they did it anyway. They made those scratchy old records because people wanted to hear their favorite artists thousands of miles away. And nobody ever knew that would be the killer app, and, or that you'd get radio and podcasting and and movies that sound really good and so on. And when the settlers came to America, they didn't know tobacco was going to be like the major thing they exported. They didn't even know it existed.
And almost all the first generation companies that made settlements in the Americas went bankrupt, and some of them went bankrupt twice over. But yeah, once they discovered tobacco, and then once chocolate started coming over, and then once the Spanish started mining Cerro Rico in what is now Bolivia and shipping huge shipfuls of silver back, then things changed.
It also affected the homeland. I mean, when tobacco started coming back to Scotland in large amounts, the ships would dock in Glasgow. The Glaswegian economy just boomed, and because they were selling, because they had made peace with their were trying to make peace with their cousins to the south. They were, and eventually formed a single country with them. They were able to make a lot of money, and you can argue, I don't know how accurate it is, you can put together a narrative that says the prosperity of Scotland due to tobacco was a direct causal factor on the Scottish Enlightenment, which led to, all kinds of wonderful things like steam engines and roads and capitalism. And
there's another important aspect of the Scottish Enlightenment that's not well known, and that is if there were only two universities in England at the time, which were Oxford and Cambridge. And to be a professor, you had to swear loyalty to the Anglican Church. So what happens is all the smart people who were nonconformists, they went over the border to Edinburgh. And Edinburgh was the center of gravity of the Scottish Enlightenment. It was because all the people who really cared about what they said and who they left the place where they were forced to conform, and they went to Scotland where they could say what they want.
Right. The now the other thing that I wanted to talk about before we close this first session here is the kind of art that, and that's what I was really hoping Daniela would be here. Unfortunately, she couldn't be. We'll catch up to Daniela some other point, but by Daniela, I mean Daniela de Paulus, who's been on before this podcast, and that was what sort of art projects would make sense in a trip around the moon. I've seen some kind of phantasmical ones like painting the moon and so forth, but that's not going to happen. So any thoughts, Nick, on you're not just taking artists around the moon, they're going to be doing their art while they're on that trip.
Well, as I said earlier in this segment, I think that that has a novelty value, but anybody who knows anything about creation knows that it takes time for something really good to develop. And if you have an incredible experience in your life, whether it be going to the moon, which very few people have had, or something else, sometimes you have to think about that experience for many years before its meaning and value become clear to you, and then you can actually work from that basis. So I think what really counts will come out many years later. There might be a novelty value to people, trying to write songs or paint pictures or something on the trip around the moon, but I doubt much of truly great quality will come out of those efforts. I could be wrong, but I think the impact will be significantly delayed. That doesn't mean that media won't pump this stuff up, because the culture of what great art used to be, if we look at great monuments of human art, like the Parthenon or something like that. It took a long time to do it. Nobody expected it to happen. There wasn't any 24/7 media cycle. Nobody had to be presented as the next big thing for their 15 minutes of fame to the public. That's how the best art comes about. The stuff that gets pushed by the media is usually garbage, unfortunately. That's potential downside, is thinking that you have to push something forward as though it's great instead of waiting for whatever it is to mature and come to a mature expression in a masterpiece, which may eventually be produced.
Right. Well, my own thinking on this is that something in performing arts might be better, because
I would agree with that.
Musicians and dancers spend many, many years working extremely hard to prepare themselves for those moments, but those moments don't have to be. Yes. They can be more spontaneous. Now, you can put a dancer up in the Vomit Comet, and they can learn how to do moves in 0G and prepare for that way. A musician, well, I have no idea, but we've already had music in space. We had Chris Hadfield playing Space Oddity on his guitar on the space station, which I thought.
I agree. Performance art would be better. Yeah. And if they brought a string quartet along, that would be a very dramatic moment to have something like that playing while they're slowly, beautifully going around the moon. It's just like, that even people who weren't into space were very deeply affected by the 2001 scene where you have Strauss's Blue Danube playing while the spaceships gently float through space.
Right. But a lot of people were very moved, myself included, by the song Space Oddity being played on the space station. And that's not a new song. It's not even really necessarily about space travel. But because later on he did a song where Major Tom's a junkie. It was still had a kind of a beauty to it. So if you took a really great musician up there, or musicians plural, and let them create, I think you could get something. It might not be that popular, but it would be, it'd be the start of something. If you could predict what that leads to, then it wouldn't be worth doing.
Right. If you get something great out of it, it would be inherently unpredictable. So,
anyway, Nick, I think we're taking a little break. Maybe we'll come back for episode 98 in a few minutes if we can find the rest of our panel. But if not, this has been episode 97 of the Unseen Podcast. I'm Paul Carr, joined by Nick Nielsen, and we will let you know if episode 98 comes out. So stay tuned, and goodbye. This has been the Unseen Podcast, the unscripted, uncut, and open participation podcast from Dream of the Open channel. For more information, including show notes for this episode, please visit unseenpodcast.com. You can also follow us on Twitter @PodcastUnseen. If you are interested in joining one or more panels on this podcast, then you can. No subject matter expertise or podcasting experience is required, and we're always eager to add new panelists. Just email unseenpodcast@gmail.com and we'll get you started. The Unseen Podcast is produced by Paul Carr and is released under the Creative Commons Attribution Share-alike license. Music is by DJ Spooky.